One of the things that piss me off when it comes to the dictatorial rule by one person classrooms in the public schools is when it comes to the area of history. If you're having to sit down, shut up, and just accept whatever crap is coming out of this person's mouth as being the gospel truth, well, that puts a heavy burden on the person who's telling, who's teaching, who's supposed to be teaching history. If I have to be 100% compliant, then you have to be 100% correct. Remember, growing up, high school, the social studies teacher asked us what the first amendment to the Constitution of the United States was. I raised my hand and I said, freedom of speech. She says, no, that's not it. And eventually she explains, well, freedom of religion is the important one, when I pointed out that freedom of speech is in the First Amendment. But clearly a dictator doesn't want you to know that you got freedom of speech. Clearly they don't want you to utilize it to stand up and to speak up. And then another factual thing, there was the operation, D-Day operation was Operation something, I don't know, Blackheart or something, Operation Overload. So you overload the dryer and it all spills over. But she said either overload or overlord. She said the operation name incorrectly, pointed it out, and instead of saying, well, oh my God, here I'm teaching 100% compliance and pretending that every word that comes out of my mouth is the gospel truth, when in reality it wasn't. It was live, and she was just going to let them set. If I didn't say, hey, this isn't correct, she would have just let that set. You just memorized facts that aren't correct. Who gives a shit? It's your life, not mine. So going through the public education system, also went to college, took American history, a lot of history courses. A big problem with being a dictator and telling, one person telling you what the history of an entire nation is. There's lots of problems. First of all, your own history doesn't matter. Shut up, sit down. That's only what I say is the history. Well, what about my history and my people? No, that doesn't matter. We're all Americans, so all of our collective histories belongs to the canon of, the history of America. But a bigger one is they omit some of the biggest things, out of the curriculum. The three biggest stories that I wish actually that they would have picked up, that would have been told to me that I would have given more credit where credit is due, is the Weather Underground, Jim Jones, and Simon Girty. These are substantially important, and for Kentucky history, William Goebel. You're not a real Kentuckian if you don't know who William Justice Goebel was, the bright, shining hope of the bluegrass state. So don't say, oh, I love Kentucky, if you don't even know the history of Kentucky. You love Kentucky. In fact, it's my love for my native state that prevents me from being a Yankee or Confederate. We were a border state, but we sided with the Union. The government sided with the Union. We kicked out the president or the governor who was a Confederate, and 100,000 of our citizens fought for the Confederacy. 40,000 fought for the Confederacy. So for the Union, 100,000 fought for the Union, for the North, and 40,000 fought for the Confederacy. And out of the 100,000 that fought for the North, 25,000 of them were the newly freed African American, ex-slaves, the newly freed slaves. And so there were just as many black people fighting for the North as there were Confederates in the state of Kentucky. It was overwhelming in favor of the Union, and to ignore some of that, I'm Kentucky. So if you're pro-Kentucky, you're not part of the Confederacy, since Kentucky didn't go to the Confederacy. And so I'm too Kentucky to really side with one or the other. I'm in favor of slaves being free, and I'm also in favor of freedom and independence. So I think federal overreach, imperialistic overreach, colonialism, I think there are some elements of that, but really it's all horseshit just so that the Southern planters could maintain their domination over black people. 400 planters, that's why everybody, and then there was the, conscription. The Confederacy, the South had to draft. You know, you are going to fight for us regardless if you want to or not. And the draft, I don't know who loves the draft. It's not, I'm defending my honor, my family, my nation. It's, I'm not going to die because my name's been called up. And if I don't go, then I'll be in jail or I'll be, you know, shot. So there's, you know, the Weather Underground, there's Jim Jones, and then Simon Girty. And Simon Girty is actually all I want to talk about. But real quickly, the Weather Underground, they had bombed like 100 different statues in symbolic positions and places during the 60s, 70s, Vietnam era, during the Nixon administration. Eventually Nixon pulls out, and he said that the protesters had an effect. So this is the Weather Underground. This is a, you know, a sort of white terrorist group, a group of revolutionaries who were so pissed off about the war, but not knowing what power they had as citizens, taking us to the next level. If we're serious about stopping the war, then this is what we need to do. And they had, you know, followers. They had to remain in exile and hiding for many years. Eventually, some of them came forward, and they were, you know, the jury exonerated them, and now they're free to, you know, to walk amongst us. Bill Ayers, that's the terrorist that Obama is hanging out with, that seeded his first campaign, was, you know, Sarah Palin said that Obama pals around with terrorists. That was Bill Ayers. He was a part of the Weather Underground. There's a whole documentary, fascinating documentary, from start to finish. The Weather Underground, check them out. To ignore the Weather Underground during the 60s and 70s is to ignore, you know, perhaps the main thrust of why Nixon pulled us out of the war. That's one thing fascists understand. You know, you had Stokely Carmichael said that the problem with nonviolence is that you assume your opponent has a conscience. What if they don't have a conscience? Well, the only thing fascists understand is, you know, violence. Do as, you know, as you're told, compliance, violence and compliance. So whether it was as a propaganda to spread their message, their anti-war message, because it wasn't to force them to capitulate. They weren't, you know, invading the country, but just sort of taking pot shots, sort of like the Native Americans or the American revolutionaries, you know, against Great Britain. While they were in redcoats, you know, the Americans were out in the woods, and they were so smart for doing that. But, you know, only during the Revolution were they smart in doing that. Now it's dishonorable, right? It's not. To be a pirate is a crime, but to be a mercenary for the empire, that's acceptable. So that's the Weather Underground. Weather Underground's a fantastic, you know, chapter of American history. And then you have Jim Jones. Now, Jim Jones, some things that he had done when they talk about drinking the Kool-Aid, it's actually not correct because he had Flavor Aid. But he had a religious cult. He was sort of a communist Christian, you know, anti-racist. He was, you know, saying a lot of truth, but it was more for internal repression. Started a ministry out California, Arizona, somewhere out west. Got tired of, you know, the United States, and so started his own colony, I want to say in Guyana or somewhere in South America. And while he was in South America, he has about 100 followers. He's got this little colony out there. And they started hearing bad reports. They sent a congressman there. When they sent the congressman to go check out South America to see if, you know, the abuse and the mind control experiments, all the things that they were doing was to be true, Jim Jones kills the congressman, kills everybody on the plane, and then once he's basically fucked up, you know, beyond all redemption, he said, well, since they're never going to leave us alone, we got to employ the final solution. And Huey Newton talks about revolutionary suicide. It was the biggest mass suicide, I want to say, ever in all of history, but definitely American history. And so, you know, 1,000 people lined up to drink poisoned Flavor Aid, and they all killed themselves. And there were some objections. Jim Jones's final tape is online. You can check it out. That's breathtaking. It's sick, disgusting, and only one person stood up to stop that groupthink. But Jim Jones was an oppressor, and he had speaker systems, you know, that's propaganda was the words to, you know, speak out loud. It says Hitler And that's what Jim Jones used. He had speaker systems every day. They were drilling in case something like this had to happen. It was only for, just in case, just for emergencies. But eventually they got so smooth at their drills when Jim Jones says, fuck it, they're never going to leave us alone. It's time for us just to go. When the adults, I don't know, it's your life. You got a right to, take your own life if you want to. That's not a crime. How can you even enforce something like that? Make them feel bad. You'll be in hell. But it's their life. They don't want to go on. I think it's selfish and bullshit, but it's their life, And so if an adult chooses it, I think that that's acceptable. That's okay. But they were making the babies. They were making the toddlers. They were making the children to drink the Kool-Aid too. And then supposedly Jim Jones was shot. He didn't even take drink the poison, made everybody else drink the poison. Then slowly everybody started dying. And they went to the colony and just saw 1,000 dead bodies. So whenever they talk about, why don't you just drink the Kool-Aid, they're talking about Jim Jones, and they're talking about Jonestown. That's what they call that colony in South America. You don't want to drink the Kool-Aid because if you do, you just go along, follow in the crowd, and then it ends your life. It's, suicide. So that's fantastic. That's another, 60s, 70s story that got somehow omitted. The dictator says, here's what happened in American history, but they forgot so many, essential, the Harlan County, Bloody Harlan, I don't remember being taught about that, the strikers, the turn of the century. There's actually, probably every decade I probably could point out a whole bunch of stuff that wasn't, but it was the Weather Underground, it was Jim Jones, and Simon Girty. These are such huge historical figures. If you don't know who they are, and you don't know American history, you don't have the complete picture. Supposedly our side's always right and good, the other side was bad, and everything that we did was moral and just. Well, look at, the War of 1812. That isn't what happened in the War of 1812. So this brings us to Simon Girty. Simon Girty lived, during the time of the War of 1812. Here's a graphic novel of Simon Girty, the true story of Simon Girty, the Renegade. Awesome graphic novel. I'll actually read 2 scenes, quick pages, just 4 pages or so later on. But Simon Girty is a white man who started out fighting for the Americans. Well, they're all British, right? Let's start there. The French and Indian War was a 7 years war that happened before the American Revolution and sort of set up the conditions for the American Revolution. But George Washington was the one who started the French and Indian War as a British commander. He was in the woods of Ohio, saw some French people, killed them, and then eventually they captured him and made him sign a statement saying that he had murdered this, colonel or general of the French forces instead of saying that it was an act of warfare. Because if they say that it's murder, well then they can hang him, they can, kill him. So the fact that they only made him sign it and then let him go, they probably should have just took care of him then and there, and then they wouldn't have lost the entire war the way the House of Commons or Parliament had talked about. The French and Indian War was like, we're going to have this big war of empire in some backwoods in the middle of nowhere. And so that's George Washington. George Washington was British. Daniel Boone was British. They all were British, right? Everybody, the English colonists were British colonists eventually, and then they became Americans, right, in their show of independence. So that's the same as Simon Girty. Now, Simon Girty actually comes back, though, because Simon Girty, he was born in 1741, and I think he's like the Highlander. He is the Forrest Gump of history. He was there for all the major things from, 1741 is when he was born, so you can't really say much about what he was having to go through, but it's indicative, it's a good example of what the colonists and what they had to go through. When he was, so 1741 he is born, and then let's say he's born in Pennsylvania, and November 14th. So he's born November 14th, 1741, and again I want to say it's Pennsylvania. Harrisburg. So, Simon Girty the elder and Mary Newton had Simon Girty in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Well, within, a short amount of time, Simon Girty winds up getting kidnapped, and he gets adopted by the Seneca tribe. He's got 4 brothers. I want to say 5 if you count that, or 6 if you count the half-brothers. But there's Simon, and then there's George, and then there's somebody else. Simon, George, James. Those are the 3 biggest names because they all eventually deflected and fought for the Native Americans under, the British Crown. So it's indicative 741. He wasn't in any major thing in 741, but his father is killed either in a duel or by a Native American. We don't know how. So his father's killed, and then he has to take a stepfather, John Turner, and then eventually John Turner is killed by the Indians. And he was a sort of a military man who was supposed to protect the fort. And I don't know, the history that I've read about it was actually that the Native Americans who had captured John Turner thought that he had stolen Simon Girty, the elder, senior's family. And in the way he did, but we don't know if it was done intentionally or by happenstance. If John Turner is the guy who came in and helped a widow and her children take care of her children, well, that's a good man. If John Turner was the one that brought about the death of Simon Girty the elder, then he's a bad man. Well, the Native Americans thought the latter. They thought that John Turner had killed Simon Girty's father, and they liked him. The French, actually, there was one good thing with the French. This is actually British. I don't know. They were good in their tradings. They were fair in their dealings with the trading. So just like the French, Simon Girty's, he was an Irishman, so he's already different than, your Anglo-Saxons. And he's trading fairly. He keeps on encroaching and getting farther and farther. The British authorities burned Simon Girty's house down. So if someone burns your house down, could they also set you up to, put you in a duel or get you killed? Perhaps, I don't know. But that's what the Native Americans did. They killed John Turner. They killed John Turner right in front of Simon Girty, the younger, and James and George and Simon Turner, or John Turner Jr. So John, that's actually the best way to cleanse, right, of a person of their loyalties if you're a Native American. They, somebody got rid of his father, and then the stepfather, they burned him at the stake right in front of the family, showing that he ain't shit, he ain't nothing. I want to say the Romans, I don't know, I heard about some military people or tribes, ancient, history, where they would go into town and then they would rape the chief, the main person in the tribe or the community who was the chief, the number one guy. They would rape him. They would just take him to another town, bend him over, and rape him. And the point of that is to say, I can take away your manhood. I can take away, look, this is your leader. This is who you all, are worshiping. Well, look what I just did. And it's not only a power thing, but it's a humiliation thing. If you're a man who allows something like that to happen, well, then clearly you can't be a real man. If you're not a real man for yourself, how can you be a real man for the community? And so that's what I think that the Native Americans were doing with John Turner. And then once they had burned John Turner at the stake, they separated all the children. I want to say James Girty, James Girty went with the Shawnee, George Girty went with the Delaware, and Simon Girty went with the Seneca, the Western Seneca, a.k.a. the Ohio Mingo, who was, Talgayita and Chief Plucky Minoti. They were both Mingo warriors, and the Mingos were sort of an offshoot of the Mohawks. They were like the people who rebelled against the Iroquois, not just the Mohawks, but all 5 nations of the Iroquois, and started their own thing in the Ohio region. And so that's who had kidnapped Simon Girty. So, he's 8, 10 years old or so, been living as a settler, just being a kid, whatever, just learning English and trying to, live in a hand-to-mouth existence, and then he is kidnapped by the Seneca. So now he has got a new family, a new father, and new experiences. In the Seneca, that we find out actually who Simon Girty was 15 years old. The Lenape is the Delaware. They kept 10-year-old George Girty, 13-year-old James Girty were taken by the Shawnee warriors, just like Mary and baby John Turner. So Shawnee got the lion's share. They got the mother, they got the baby John Turner, and then they got James Girty. But 15-year-old Simon Girty was given to Gaius Suta. Now, Gaius Suta is the chief of the Ohio Seneca. Gaius Suta is, when you look at Gaius Suta's history, Gaius Suta was right there in the middle of, so many events. Simon Girty, from the time he was born, from 1741 to 20-something, because he lived to be an old man, he was in every period, everything in, early American history that you could think of. Every important battle, every important, even political, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix of 1768. He was there. Simon Girty was the principal interpreter. So that's where Simon Girty's benefit actually comes from. So, I don't know. Here's a quick overall history of what Simon Girty is. He's a white man who was fighting with the Americans. They treated him bad, so after the Squaw Campaign, he deflected and wanted to fight for the Native Americans, but, under the British Crown. So I don't feel like he's a Benedict Arnold. I feel like he's a Tecumseh lover. He's an Indian lover, an Indian lover. And so after the Squaw Campaign, when they were just going around killing just, random Indians just for the hell of it, he hated it and said, fuck this, I'm not doing this, goes to Detroit and, fights on the British Crown side. And, he's a white man who fought for the Native Americans. So when it comes to revolutionaries, I can only think of, Tecumseh, Chief Pluggy, Dragon Canoe. Any of the Native Americans were definitely revolutionary if they took up the hatchet, if they stood and fought and stood their ground, fought for their castle. Because if they did that, then that just shows, that they were fighting for themselves, their family, their land, and said no more, enough is enough. And when you look at history, there's no Native Americans in our society to speak of. So the few ones that actually said, they're going to try to exterminate us, they're going to try to wipe us all out. Those people were prophetic. They knew what was going on, and so they were the only revolutionaries that there were. The American revolutionaries, it was a war of independence. They were able to destroy the bonds of Great Britain and establish their own government. Bill of Rights eventually came in. But, it was still an aristocracy. It was land speculators. Washington, Patrick Henry, they all were plantation slave owners, and they wanted Indian land. And they were with the Ohio Company. They were all speculators, So I don't know how revolutionary the American Revolution actually was, because women didn't get a right to vote, black people, Native Americans, even white men who were either under 21, all people under 21, or white men who did not own property. If you didn't own property, and you were a woman, black, or mulatto, or brown, right, Native American, you weren't a citizen. So this only guaranteed the right to property-owning white men. So still the upper class. And I would say actually a lot of that, those origins are still with us today. So that's the overall, he's a white man who fought for the Native Americans. So, awesome. That's badass. The fact that I didn't even know about Simon Girty, the reason why there's no other villain that was used as propaganda worse than Simon Girty. Even though he wasn't the leader of an Indian band or Indian tribe, anytime he was with them in a raid, they elevated him to a person that they could attack. How dare they? It was bad enough that the Shawnee were savages and attacking poor mothers and their babies, but now you have a white face. And so all of history could say, well, perhaps the Native Americans weren't wrong because they had a white face to sort of represent them. So the things that Simon Girty, I'm just going to go through all the stuff that Simon Girty had gone through. So he's born in 1741, he's kidnapped by the Seneca. He was at the American Revolution, but before the Revolution, he was with Gaius Suta. And that's after he's with Gaius Suta, he comes back and he knows 11 Native American languages, and he was used as an interpreter. And so, they tried to use the services. They tried to bring him back, but they didn't do a good job. They didn't pay him. They didn't give a commander's pay. And there was a Squaw Campaign. So I'm going to get to that in a second. When he was with the Seneca, Gaius Suta fought in many battles during the period that Simon Girty had actually stayed with him. Gaius Suta was instrumental in the defeat of Major James Grant at the Battle of Fort Duquesne, 1758. The French and Indian War ended in 1763, but the hostilities between the British and the Indians continued in Pontiac's War. Gaius Suta and Ohio Seneca were allied with Pontiac, so they were instrumental in Pontiac's War, the French and Indian War. They were there, Battle of Fort Duquesne, they were there, Pontiac's War, the continuation of the French and Indian War. Once the French had signed concessions, the French didn't, fight for the Indians anymore, but they had given the land that the Indians had lived on, so they totally sold the Native Americans out. But the Native Americans knew about that, and they kept on fighting. All the French forts all of a sudden became British forts, and so out of nowhere, Pontiac's revenge or Pontiac's rebellion had just sort of a spontaneous rebellion where they attacked about 13 different forts that were on, the frontier. And that just happened. It wasn't a concerted effort. It wasn't one leader, but Pontiac wound up getting the credit. I want to say Little Turtle and Pontiac, I want to say that they both were given credit for the war. So, let's see. They fought along the British during the siege of Fort Pitt, 1763, the Battle of Bloody Run, the Battle of Bushy Run, Devil's Hole Massacre, and it was the deadliest engagement for British soldiers during the war. So Gaius Suto was fighting the British and all these things in 1763 during Pontiac's rebellion. And to think that 15-year-old, he was 15 when he was taken, right, which was 1756. So if he's 15 years old in 1756, fast forward 7 years, he's 22 years old. You're telling me a 22-year-old able-bodied male is just sitting at home not doing anything? Bullshit. He's with the tribes, and he's with Gaius Suto, and he's, attacking the British. So he was killing British way before George Washington started killing British. In fact, George Washington would be, against him in Gaius Suto, But then once they signed the agreement, 1763 and 1764, the next year, they went ahead and signed, a treaty, and part of the treaty was to give the captives back. So even though Simon Girty was picked up when he was 15, had known, the Seneca way of life, now he had to go back to the British, even though he didn't know any, if his mom or dad, he knew his father was dead, but he didn't have any relationships when he returned back. There's actually a Disney movie that was reminded me very much of Simon Girty, who was, this blue-eyed, white, young man, boy-ish, 15-year-old teenager, comes back and, doesn't know anybody. He is a Native American for all intents and purposes. So, I'm just going to, so then after he comes out, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, that's him. He was a part of Lord Dunmore's war. He's a part of the British now, so now he's a part of Lord Dunmore's war. Basically, I guess a mercenary type person because he's, with the French, with Gaius Suto, and just his allegiances just keep on switching all around. Lord Dunmore's war, this is the British attacking the Native Americans. Eventually, the Battle of Point Pleasant, where they get Cornstalk to sign the Treaty of Camp Charlotte. But this had all started, and in fact, Battle of Point Pleasant is the first war of the American Revolution, and the Battle of Blue Licks is the last war of the American Revolution, and Simon Girty was there for both. Simon Girty was there for the first and last battle of the American Revolution. And so, how do you not know about this guy? Just, eventually, he was there at the War of 1812, sort of here and there. He was at the McGarry's defeat, Blue Lick, Hamar's defeat, Hosea's defeat, Morgan Station, Ruddles and Martin Station. There was an ambush in Dayton, Kentucky, the Siege of Boonesboro. There was Hand's Squaw Campaign. Squaw Campaign, when he deflected, they went out and just, they killed just some random Native Americans, an old woman and some kids. And it turned out, and an old man, and then the old man was Chief Pike's brother. So they went to a desolated, a village, killed just a few of the Native Americans who were staying there, and it turns out they were very political. I want to say Chief Pike was a big Iroquois or so. So this is beforehand, okay? So, all the Gaius Suto, Pontiac's War, and all the rest of that was beforehand. After the, the Declaration of Independence, you have, lots more things, right? So Simon's an escort for Gaius Suto. He was in Pequot Town, but George Rogers Clark had burned it down. George Rogers Clark instituted the draft, so another comparison with the Confederacy. At Harrodstown in 1780, and it was after the attack on Ruddle and Martin Station. So, that was in retaliation for Simon Girty. But that Squaw Campaign is why he deflected. While he deflected, he was, fighting for the, for the Native Americans. Him and Joseph Brant had got into it, Pequot Town, Black Hoof, the Siege of the Still Station, Pompeii, St. Clair, Hamar's defeat, some of the biggest Indian battles after the Revolution was over. He was a part of Blue Lick's defeat. I mean, the first and last battle. I have a whole list of things here, so I think I'm going to have to